Over the last 140 or so million years, our climates globally have continued to dry. CO2 concentrations have continued to decrease. Humans and humanoids evolved in a low CO2 world. By about 20 million years ago, the CO2 concentrations began to get low enough that opening up stomata to allow for more gases to diffuse in still wasn't enough. The CO2 concentrations were getting low enough that CO2 diffusion was seriously limiting photosynthesis. At that time, we see the evolution and then rapid expansion about 8 to 10 million years ago of a brand new photosynthetic pathway. The first time we've seen a fundamentally new photosynthetic pathway in about 3 billion years. That is C4 photosynthesis. And C4 plants have a striking effect on animal diets, specifically digestibility. Beginning about 50 million years ago, as ecosystems, as continental areas dried out, grassland ecosystems evolved. Grasses are monocots. And beginning about 50 million years ago, grasslands exploded onto the landscape. Grasses are typically herbaceous. That means the stem dies back each year. But here, in the evolution of grasses, we find the cuticle, the stomates, but a change was taking place in these cells here that surrounded the xylem and phloem. Hear ye, come read the paper. Adapt or die is the scream. Because as grasslands evolved, a new kind of chemical defense arose, the phytolith, plant rock. A phytolith looks a bit like a dumbbell weight, and it's made of silicon dioxide sand. The challenge facing animal systems, such as this horse here, figuring out if it should adapt or die, so to speak, is that chewing wears down the teeth, especially if the grass contains phytoliths. So as grasslands evolved, and as plants with phytoliths became more prominent, we saw a change in the evolution of the kind of teeth that animals had for eating plants. That was the evolution of what we called the hypsodont or high-crown tooth, which is a tooth which is continuously growing from the base. And today what we find is that if we look at the teeth of mammalian grazer systems, they fall into one of two categories. Either a high-crowned hypsodont, and those are mammal herbivores that eat grasses, or a low-crowned brachydont, and those are animals that eat shrubs or trees. The grass eaters face the phytolith as a chemical defense. The brachydonts face secondary compounds as a defense. And what we see is that over time, that the low-crowned brachydonts were the only grass on the landscape. And then beginning about 20 million years ago and accelerating about 10 million, 12 million years ago, was an increase in the abundance of high-crowned grass-eating mammals. So what we see here is essentially the expansion of grasslands on the continent of North America as measured by the number of different fossil teeth species with fossil teeth. So we didn't have grasslands predominant some 35 million years ago, but as recently as 2 million years ago, grasses were quite common. Associated with the expansion of grasslands was a new kind of photosynthesis called C4 photosynthesis. In C3 photosynthesis, virtually all the cells are able to take carbon dioxide up, mix a 5-carbon molecule, ribulose bisphosphide carboxylase, with CO2 and form 2 3-carbon molecules. It's called C3 photosynthesis because the first stable product, as we mentioned earlier, is a C3 compound. That eventually results in the formation of sugars. So this is what a C3 plant looks like, and here rice is shown as an example. On the other hand, in C4 plants, the first compound formed is a C4 compound, where we have phosphoenol pyruvate, a compound you might remember from biology 1610, and anaerobic metabolism. A 3 and a 1 make a 4. That C4 acid diffuses into these interior cells called the bundle seed cells, where the C4 acid is decarboxylated, and now we go through the same C3 cycle. What makes this cycle work is the fact that there are two carboxylases, Peptoboxylase fixing CO2 initially, and RUBP carboxylase fixing CO2 secondarily. Peptoboxylase is a very fast enzyme, high turnover rate. So whenever CO2 is in this part of the plant, it's quickly fixed into a C4 acid, and when it decarboxylates, the CO2 reaction, fixation reaction, takes place in a high CO2 environment. CO2, once inside the bundle seed cells, cannot escape. So we have a spatial separation of the carboxylation reactions, with one enzyme being very fast, the other being slow. That creates a pump. The consequence of this pump is that the CO2 concentration on the inside, where photosynthesis takes place, is very high. How high? About 1,500 to 2,500 parts per million. So even though the CO2 concentration might be 500, 400, 300, or 200 parts per million, these plants are able to create a high CO2 environment by using this pumping mechanism. And the evolution of C4 photosynthesis is thought to be an evolutionary response to a low CO2 world. Today, C4 plants are quite common. They are among the most productive crop plants that we have. Even though on a global basis, C4 plants might be less than 5% of all the plant species, they are more than 25% of the world's primary productivity. Among the C4 productive plants are corn, sorghum, and sugarcane. In Africa, we would add millet to that group. The evolution of C4 plants and of phytoliths now has resulted in two different kinds of mammalian grazers. We have the browsers. Browsers eat C3 plants, such as this tree, and they don't contain phytoliths. On the other hand, zebra are grazers. Grazers are animals that eat grasses, and grasses have phytoliths. So there's a difference in the chemical defense, the presence of phytoliths or not, and that distinguishes browsers from grazers. So C3 and C4 photosynthesis results in two kinds of herbivory in the same ecosystem, such as shown here in the savanna plains of Kenya. So what is different about browsers versus grazers? It's the necessity to chew a material or to grind a material in order to get out the protein. So in plants that are browsed, the brachiodont is able to quickly with a few bites of chewing, release the proteins that are inside the cell walls. That's not the case in grasses. So in addition to having thicker cell walls, grasses have these phytoliths, and that wears down the teeth of the grass-eating herbivores. Okay, let's go back. Talk about diversity over time with some clicker questions. In class, we would ask what features allowed angiosperms to become the most diverse group that invaded land. I'll let you answer with a 1 or 2 word clicker response. Let me summarize today's lecture by mentioning 2 overarching themes that permeate angiosperm evolution. The coevolution of plants and animals, which we see through pollination, seed dispersal, chemical defenses, and 2, the adaptive response to an environment that has less CO2 and is drier. And that's associated with the evolution or expansion of vessel elements, changes in stomatal densities, the emergence of grasses as a life form, and ultimately the emergence and expansion of C4 photosynthesis.